Flashback to the 1940s. China is unraveling, and the old guard is rapidly losing its grip to a massive red wave. This isn't a chaotic mob. It's a precision machine, backed by Soviet muscle. Mao Zedong is at the helm, sweeping across the map and pushing the ruling party to the brink. The nationalists have nowhere left to run but the sea. Their leaders, along with 1 million troops and loyalists, scramble onto ships and planes, fleeing across the strait to a liberated rock formerly held by Japan. Mao's forces hit a wall. Literally, a wall of water. Without a navy or air power, the revolution stops at the shoreline. So, the battered Republic of China finds a temporary sanctuary on this offshore fortress. This isn't just some random spit of land. 4 centuries back, Portuguese sailors dubbed it Ilha Formosa, the beautiful island. It was the prize jewel for empires everywhere, thanks to its rich soil and prime spot right in the jugular of Asian trade routes. Japan held the keys for 50 years, but after the dust settled on World War II, the victors decided it was time to return it to Chinese hands. That island is Taiwan, and suddenly, it became the last stand for the Republic of China. While they catch their breath across the water, Mao stands on the mainland and unveils the People's Republic of China, promising to shake off foreign chains and restore national glory. Barely 24 hours later, the Soviets give him the nod, officially recognizing his regime as the real deal. But don't let the flags fool you. The fight is far from finished. It's a standoff. Both sides insist they run the show. The exiles on the island aren't planning to stay put. They're plotting to storm back and reclaim the mainland. To keep order, they turn the island into a fortress state. Dissenters, suspected spies, or anyone dreaming of independence are rounded up, locked away, or worse. Across the water, Mao is busy constructing a fleet, gearing up to bridge that gap and crush the final pocket of resistance. His goal is simple: paint the entire map red. But history has other plans. Enter the United States. Fresh off beating Japan, they're actually looking to pack up and head home, leaving Asia in the rearview mirror. They see the mess brewing, but the strategy is hands-off. Not our circus, not our monkeys. Sure, they despise the new communist regime and refuse to acknowledge it, but their eyes are fixed on rebuilding a shattered Europe, not getting bogged down in the East. They've just forged a massive alliance with their European buddies to hold the line against Moscow's influence there. The Soviets went from wartime pals to arch-nemeses overnight. And the scary part? They've got the bomb now, just like the Americans. Only took them 4 years to catch up. Then comes the kicker. The U.S. Secretary of State literally draws a line on a map during a press briefing, declaring anything beyond it isn't Uncle Sam's problem. That leaves Korea out in the cold, along with Taiwan, the very place they promised to return to China. It also abandons Vietnam, where locals are busy throwing out the French and setting up another communist state with backing from Beijing and Moscow. Washington is worried, sure, but technically, this chaos is happening outside their safety fence. Back home, hardliners are screaming that Asia is falling to the Reds. But President Truman shrugs it off, calling it a local family feud that they need to sort out themselves. That is the game plan. Until the world turns upside down. Summer, 1950. A massive wave of troops from the Soviet-backed North pours across the border in Korea. They steamroll the American-aligned South, swallowing up nearly the entire peninsula in just 11 weeks. These aren't ragtag rebels. They're rolling in with heavy Soviet tanks and artillery. The invasion only happened because Joseph Stalin gave the thumbs up after checking with Mao first, of course. Mao wasn't exactly thrilled about poking the American bear, but he couldn't look weak. He had to prove he was down for the global revolution. So, he prepares to send his own soldiers into the meat grinder to back up his comrades. At this point, the US has 0 boots on the ground in Korea. But watching the map collapse, their indifference evaporates. It looks less like a civil war and more like a grand communist master plan to dominate the region. Washington decides enough is enough. They step over their own imaginary line and go all in to hold back the red tide. Truman hits the airwaves, announcing troops for Korea. But he drops another bombshell. The 7th Fleet is heading to the Taiwan Strait to stop any fighting there cold. Taking Taiwan is now officially off the table for Mao. To explain this massive flip-flop, Truman pulls a legal rabbit out of his hat. He argues that Taiwan's ownership is actually up in the air. Sure, Japan gave it up in 1945, but the paperwork? Never signed. No official treaty ever decided who actually owns the place. So technically, its status is undetermined. And that loophole gives the US the legal cover to swoop in and play bodyguard. Looking at the American warships parking on his doorstep, Mao must have been kicking himself for letting that Korean invasion happen. It was beginning to look like a massive strategic blunder, one that lured the Americans right to his doorstep and blocked his shot at taking the island. For 3 agonizing years, the Korean War grinds on, finally freezing into a tense stalemate that remains unresolved to this day. By 1953, it becomes clear that the United States isn't leaving Asia anytime soon. Their goal is to stop communism dead in its tracks, so they construct a defensive perimeter of island bases facing their red adversaries. And sitting dead center in that critical line of defense? That would be Taiwan. Congress hands the president a blank check to protect the island, even clearing the way to station nuclear warheads there. Back on the mainland, Mao is overhauling the entire nation and desperately needs to rally public support. His solution is to launch a massive artillery barrage, raining tens of thousands of shells on the nearby islands still held by the Republic of China. Washington decides to send a message loud enough for Beijing to hear. Military strategists actually draft options to drop atomic bombs on the PRC. One scenario estimates the death toll could skyrocket to 1 million people if they pulled the trigger. Thankfully, they hold back on the nukes, but they do roll in with a massive naval strike force. We're talking 2 supercarriers, destroyer escorts, 56 combat jets, and a stockpile of cutting-edge missiles ready to carry nuclear payloads. That is on top of the heavy reinforcements waiting in Japan and the Philippines. America's proving it intends to keep the island safe, keeping supply routes flowing and forcing Mao to hesitate. They need him to think long and hard before trying an invasion. It starts to look exactly like the opening moves of another bloodbath, which is precisely what worries the Soviet leadership in Moscow. Khrushchev fires off a lengthy telegram to the United States, demanding they back off immediately. He condemns the hasty nuclear buildup over a Chinese island the Americans have no claim to, calling it a blatant provocation. He then reminds Washington that China has backup. The Soviets and the Chinese are comrades, brothers in the communist cause. He warns that any strike on China counts as a strike on the Soviet Union, a path that leads straight to World War III. And this time, it would be nuclear. He signs off, sincerely, N. Khrushchev. It is an incredibly dangerous standoff, and while both sides eventually blink, the conflict doesn't exactly disappear. The Americans keep thousands of troops and prime nuclear weapons on site, while across the strait, neither China wants to be the one to surrender. So, they settle for lobbing a handful of artillery shells at each other daily. It turns into a bizarre ritual, where Mao's forces fire one day, and the Taiwanese troops fire back the next. They aren't trying to kill anyone or destroy targets, just keeping the tension alive. Amazingly, this routine continues every single day for the next 21 years. Right, so we managed to dodge a global nuclear war by the skin of our teeth. Moving on. By the late 1950s and early 60s, the United States is deeply entrenched in Asia, fixated on halting communism everywhere, including Vietnam. That defensive island chain with Taiwan at the core remains crucial. The pressure keeps mounting, and by 1960, the U.S. actually stations nuclear weapons directly on Taiwan. On the other side, the Soviets are propping up the People's Republic, even helping them build their own nuclear arsenal, which goes live in 1964. The region is a powder keg, but the geopolitical landscape is about to undergo a massive shift. The 2 communist giants begin to drift apart, arguing over the true interpretation of their ideology. Mao launches a violent transformation of China, purging perceived traitors and forcing massive, risky economic experiments on the peasantry. The plan backfires spectacularly. Harvests fail, and food reserves vanish. As tens of millions starve, the Soviets view Mao as a dangerous, unstable liability who is ungrateful for their aid. Mao isn't happy either, accusing the Soviets of being fake Marxists who are getting too cozy with the capitalist West. Tempers flare until they are physically skirmishing at the border, with Moscow threatening to bomb the very nuclear facilities they helped China build. Enter the United States. Watching this communist alliance crumble, they spot a golden opportunity. Why not drive the wedge deeper? President Richard Nixon takes office in 1969, determined to play the China card against Moscow. To make it happen, he dispatches National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to open a secret back channel with Beijing. Remember, the U.S. and China were officially enemies with zero diplomatic contact. So, Kissinger has to route his secret messages through Pakistan just to get a word in. The meeting is set. Kissinger jets off to Pakistan, claiming he needs some downtime, but it's a total ruse. He slips onto a covert flight straight to Beijing, cracking open a nation that had been sealed tight for 20 years. So, what is Mao's angle here? Why is he suddenly cozying up to his arch-nemesis, the United States? It's simple calculus. He realizes the Soviet Union with guns currently trained on the Chinese border is the clear and present danger. The Americans? They might just be ready to cut a deal. But that deal has a massive roadblock. Taiwan. Mao isn't interested if the U.S. keeps troops and nukes stationed on that island and unsinkable fortress right off his front porch. Enter Kissinger, standing at a pivotal crossroads in history. He's in Beijing, sitting across from Premier Zhou Enlai, the man who executes Mao's will. They don't waste time. The conversation pivots immediately to the elephant in the room, Taiwan. Zhou is razor sharp on his history. He essentially gives Kissinger a lecture, recapping the entire saga up to this point. He jogs Kissinger's memory. Truman was initially fine with the Chinese Taiwan. Then the Korean War hit. Truman flip-flopped and slapped an undetermined label on the island's status, a stance that makes Beijing's blood boil. Overnight, the U.S. effectively occupied a Chinese territory, transforming it into a colossal military outpost. We're talking nuclear warheads stationed just 80 miles from the mainland, serving as the anchor for a containment strategy aimed squarely at China. Kissinger doesn't mince words. In private, he admits that without the Korean War, Taiwan would likely be under PRC control by now. However, he notes that previous administrations tied the island's fate directly to the Korean conflict. That brings us to today. Then Kissinger drops the pivot. Things have changed. We aren't hunting communists just for the sake of it anymore. He explains that President Nixon plays by a new rulebook. Ideology doesn't have to block friendship. His real game? Woo the PRC to drive a wedge between them and the Soviets. Despite the maneuvering, Premier Zhou signals that he takes Kissinger at his word. But he lays down the law. Is Washington ready to drop the undetermined nonsense? Will they admit Taiwan is Chinese soil and acknowledge there is only one China? He calls this the crux. No agreement on this, no relationship, period. Kissinger nods along, claiming they aren't pushing for a two-China policy. But take a closer look at his specific wording in the transcript. He gets academic, musing that political evolution will likely flow in the direction Beijing desires. It's a masterful non-answer, basically saying Taiwan will probably end up with you guys, but without making any hard promises. One expert I spoke to put it bluntly, Kissinger is effectively throwing Taiwan to the wolves here. But remember the endgame. Checkmate the Soviets. If that means making concessions to Beijing, so be it. He pledges to stifle any Taiwanese independence movements, and even commits to withdrawing all American forces. The price tag? Beijing needs to lean on their communist allies in Vietnam. The U.S. wants a peace deal, and their POWs back, so they can finally exit that quagmire. Zhou gives a tentative, "We'll see what we can do." Suddenly, the tension in the room breaks. The premier expresses hope. It's the sound of two bitter adversaries cautiously becoming partners. Then, the dominoes start falling fast. By the fall of 1971, the UN welcomes the People's Republic of China and shows Taiwan the door. Nixon follows up with his historic public visit, broadcasting to the world that the ice is melting and a new friendship is on the horizon. Formal recognition hasn't happened yet, but things are heating up. Behind the scenes, Nixon holds private sessions with Zhou Enlai, picking up where Kissinger left off. Declassified transcripts reveal a bombshell moment. Nixon, in his own words, flatly admits there is one China, and that Taiwan is part of it. He even confides that if he could wrangle the bureaucracy back in D.C., he'd scrap the undetermined status label entirely. He insists that's not his policy. You can practically smell Nixon's eagerness. He is desperate to lock this down and isolate the Soviet Union. He might be getting ahead of himself, but by 1972, the duo pulls off the impossible. The geopolitical map is rebalanced. They've secured massive leverage against Moscow by splitting the communist bloc and cozying up to Beijing. Then, the Vietnam War finally winds down. China didn't help as much as Kissinger hoped, but with American troops gone, the temperature drops significantly. By 1974, the U.S. pulls its nuclear arsenal off Taiwan. It's another deposit in the Bank of Goodwill. Shortly after, Mao passes away, and his successors step in, ready to open the doors to global trade. America smells opportunity. In the late 70s, President Jimmy Carter crosses the finish line, Nixon and Kissinger drew. Washington officially recognizes the People's Republic as the sole China, leaving Taiwan out in the cold. The embassy moves from Taipei to Beijing, and the rest of the world quickly follows suit. Simultaneously, the U.S. shreds the defense treaty, promising to protect Taiwan, and withdraws every last soldier. The daily artillery exchanges finally cease. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics ignites, and the two nations start trading, reshaping the entire global economy. It was a seismic shift in the blink of an eye. And just as Nixon and Kissinger planned, the Soviet Union was left isolated and weaker than ever. That marked the dawn of a fresh chapter in Sino-American dynamics. Yet, if you look closer, there is a catch. Despite all the handshakes and diplomatic tours, the U.S. never publicly confirmed the secret admission Nixon made behind closed doors, that the island is simply a province of the mainland. Washington acknowledges that Beijing believes this, sure, but they stick to the vague playbook Truman wrote back in the 50s. They treat the island's status as an unsolved mystery. Virtually overnight, the territory went from being a key ally to a diplomatic ghost. A lot of folks back in D.C. felt guilty about ditching a loyal friend, especially one that was rapidly transforming into a free, modern powerhouse. We are really going to toss them aside to cozy up to a totalitarian regime we used to fight? It looked like a betrayal to partners everywhere. So, while the White House was busy making friends with Beijing, Congress wrote an insurance policy. The law basically says, okay, the US won't call you a country on paper, but we are going to treat you like a distinct entity. Crucially, it states that even though our soldiers are packing up, the US is legally bound to sell the island the hardware it needs to hold its own ground. And if that wasn't enough, the U keeps the muscle ready to jump in if an invasion ever happens. However, they stop just short of promising they actually will show up. The ambiguity was the point. It was designed to keep the island confident enough not to do something rash, like declaring independence, while avoiding a firm defense pact that would enrage Beijing. Of course, the mainland views this law as a total breach of trust. They see America as a two-faced friend. You have to remember, Beijing views itself as the sole landlord, believing the island was a stolen asset due for return after World War II. The Allies promised it back then. And truth be told, the island would just be another province today if the U.S. hadn't intervened with its navy back in the 50s. That is the mainland's perspective. So they launched a charm offensive to woo the breakaway province back into the fold. But the clock had already run out. The island had evolved. It pulled off an economic miracle and shed its military junta skin to embrace full-blown democracy. By the 90s, citizens were heading to the ballot box for the first time in history. Washington loved this underdog story. They wanted to back it, even granting a visa for a Taiwanese presidential contender to visit American soil. That was the last straw for Beijing. They yanked their ambassador out of D.C. immediately. They massed 100,000 soldiers along the coast and started firing ballistic missiles that splashed down just 20 miles from the island's shores. Ships, jets, the works. It was a blockade in all but name, a screaming warning against getting too close to American ideals. But the pushback was swift. In March of 1996, the U.S. parked 2 aircraft carrier battle groups right on the doorstep. It was the biggest flex of naval power in the Pacific since the Vietnam War. The guns went silent, and against that dramatic backdrop, the island held its vote without a hitch. The people showed up in droves, 76% turnout. They gave a massive middle finger to the bullying tactics of a neighbor they no longer related to. The world watched a free society bloom right next door to a regime infamous for crushing students with tanks in Tiananmen Square. This new democratic reality cooled the warm relationship Washington had spent decades building with Beijing. The chill returned, especially since the Soviet Union had dissolved by the 90s. The common enemy that glued the U.S. and China together was gone. Suddenly, the island was the flashpoint again. But the locals knew the score. They understood America might drop them again if they lost their strategic worth. So, they made themselves impossible to ignore. The government poured money into tech, turning local factories into the kings of silicon. We are talking about the semiconductors that run the modern world. These chips became the lifeblood of both global economies and modern warfare. Their logic was simple. If we become the world's chip factory, the U.S. has to protect us. America couldn't afford to let that tech fall into Beijing's hands. The strategy worked like a charm. By the 2000s, titans like Apple, AMD, and Qualcomm were relying entirely on Taiwanese fabs for their most complex components. Take one specific giant. This company literally wouldn't exist without the island's manufacturing lines. That company is NVIDIA. So the tension simmered. But that didn't stop the mainland from trading with the U.S. and everyone else, fueling an economic explosion. They got wealthy at breakneck speed. They used that cash to build a top-tier war machine. And despite the trade, they never let anyone forget their ultimate goal, finishing the Civil War, the U.S. Interrupted. They are dead set on reclaiming the island that keeps drifting further out of reach. In 2005, Beijing made it law. They stated they prefer a peaceful reunion, but legally reserved the right to use non-peaceful means if the island ever declared formal independence. The United States refuses to accept that threat. Sticking to the One China policy, Washington notes Beijing's claim without actually agreeing to it. Their stance is clear. The future of the island must be settled peacefully, without guns, and with the consent of the people on both sides of the water. Legislation aside, the vibe across the strait actually got a lot warmer in the 90s and 2000s. It was mostly about the money, profitable deals that helped everyone out. Beijing kept sweetening the pot for a peaceful reunion, promising the locals they could hold on to their lifestyle and political systems. For a moment, there was genuine optimism floating around. But that hope evaporated pretty fast once nationalism started spiking on both sides of the water and even across the Pacific. The current chapter of this saga is directed by Xi Jinping, who took charge in 2012 with a massive ambition to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. That involves locking down their territory, with Taiwan as the ultimate prize and symbol of that goal. Xi insists it must be reunited with the mainland, and he has built up a massive military to back that up. Washington now views China as its #1 competitor, reacting with its own military surge in the area and dusting off that classic island chain strategy. It has been a mess of tech battles, tariffs, sanctions, and loud threats. Relationships between these global giants have tanked recently for reasons having nothing to do with the island, yet it reminds us that the decades-old peace here relies heavily on how these two superpowers get along. In the background, the 23 million residents on the island are busy forging their own distinct identity. Only about 12% of them want anything to do with joining the mainland, yet China keeps flexing its muscles at them. They shoot missiles overhead, run invasion rehearsals, and deploy fleets of ships and jets to choke off the island's sea and sky access for days on end. It is a demonstration of just how effortlessly they could snatch up this small territory. That is, assuming the United States does not swoop in to save them. The trillion-dollar question everyone asks is, would they actually show up? America leans on that deliberate vagueness to keep this powder keg somewhat steady. Just as designed, Taiwan now pumps out 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the chips that pushed NVIDIA to become the most valuable company on Earth. And official United States policy still insists the island's status is undecided, utilizing this calculated mystery to maintain a stable, yet incredibly fragile balance, especially as the Sino-American bond falls apart. So, Taiwan carries on its 75-year-old saga, living right in the middle of these giants wrestling for control, using the psychological weapons of mystery and deterrence to keep everybody guessing what happens next.